His father called it the Bloom Flat. Earl Duchamp had grown up with that name the way you grew up with the name of a road or a neighbor's field, something that existed before you arrived and would exist after you left, requiring no explanation because everyone who needed to know it already did. His grandfather had called it the Bloom Flat. His father had called it the Bloom Flat. Earl had called it the Bloom Flat for 60 years without one stopping to ask why. He was 73 years old. The Bloom Flat was gone. He had farmed cranberries on the bogs adjacent to the coastal wetland complex for 40 years, on land his family had worked before him. The bogs were his daughter's operation now. She had taken over 6 years ago when Earl decided the physical work had found the limit of what his body could reliably do. He still lived in a house beside the bogs and walked the edge of the property most mornings out of habit. The way a man who has spent 40 years paying attention to a piece of ground doesn't stop paying attention to it just because he's retired. The bogs still smelled the same in early morning. The property line still ran where it had always run. The things that had been true about this land for 60 years were still true, which was its own kind of comfort. The Bloom Flat was a shallow depression on the south end of the property line, just inside the wetland boundary, where the property's edge met the coastal wetland complex that stretched for several miles along the Oregon coast. It wasn't part of the Cranberry operation. It had never been part of the Cranberry operation. His father had planted bogs up to its edge and stopped, and his father's father had done the same before him, because of what the Bloom Flat did in March. In March, the Bloom Flat flooded first, before the surrounding wetland. Before the bogs were showing any measurable change in water table, the Bloom Flat filled, quietly from below, fed by something in the subsurface hydrology that the surrounding ground didn't share. Earl had never understood why. He had looked at it for 60 years and accepted it the way you accepted the particular temperature of a spring or the direction a wind usually came from, or any other characteristic of a place that was simply true without requiring an explanation you had the right vocabulary to give. And when it filled, it turned, not a dramatic color, not the red of certain algae or the yellow of sulfur, but a particular pale green that Earl had always associated with early spring the way other people associated with crocuses or robins, a thin bloom of something in the water, specific to this depression, arriving every year like a clock. His father had said, "You don't plant in the Bloom Flat. The water doesn't behave the way it behaves in the rest of the bog." That was the full explanation Earl had ever received, and it had been sufficient, because he was a cranberry farmer and not a wetland ecologist, and what he needed to know was where to plant and where not to plant, not why. He had not planted in the Bloom Flat. Neither had his father. The name had been the only documentation. The highway interchange project had been announced 3 years ago, during Earl's 3rd year of retirement. He had attended the public hearings the way he attended most public hearings, dutifully, skeptically, without much expectation that the outcome would differ from what the project team had already decided. He had listened to the traffic projections, the economic analyses, the environmental impact summary. The southern footprint of the proposed interchange ran through the wetland complex. He had looked at the project maps carefully that evening at home, spreading them across the kitchen table under the lamp. They were engineering drawings, precise and confident, the kind of document that assumed the world consisted only of what it depicted. The footprint was marked in orange. He had traced it with his finger from the highway alignment south toward the property boundary and then, on the far side of property line, into the wetland. The orange line went through the Bloom Flat. He had sat with that for a long time. The maps didn't show the Bloom Flat. Of course they didn't. The Bloom Flat wasn't on any map. It was on his family's property in the sense that his grandfather's voice was still in the air of that kitchen, which was also not something you could put on a map. Then he had gone to bed without deciding what to do about it. The problem was that the Bloom Flat wasn't on any map he could find, not on the county's wetland delineation maps, not on the state's coastal wetland inventory, not on any document he had ever seen in 40 years of farming the adjacent property. He had spent 2 evenings searching online, and another morning at the county offices, before he was satisfied that the absence was complete. It existed, as far as official geography was concerned, as a nameless and apparently unremarkable depression on the southern edge of a wetland complex, classified as ordinary and left without designation because nothing in the survey record had ever caught in the state. It only entered for 2 months every year. It was named only in his family. The name had never traveled beyond the people who farmed around it. A name given to something by 3 generations of farmers for the purpose of knowing not to plant that was not the same as a datum in any database anyone consulted. He went to look at it in January, a cold, clear morning after a week of rain, pulling on his boots and walking the property line the way he had for 40 years. The bloom flat was flooded earlier than usual, given the season's rainfall, but that was not unexpected. He stood at its edge and looked at the water. It was the palest shade of green, barely there, visible only at a certain angle when the light hit the water surface. The bloom, right on schedule or early, or whenever the subsurface said it was time, which was not necessarily the same as when the calendar said it was time. He took a photograph with his phone. He had not thought about why he was photographing it until he was already walking back to the house. He thought, because I don't know if it'll still be here next year. That was why. He had spent 60 years looking at this thing without photographing it because there had never been a reason to. It was simply there every March, the way the trees were there and the mud was there and the particular light of early Oregon spring was there. You didn't photograph the light. You lived in it. Now it was threatened, and he photographed it the way you photograph something you were afraid to lose, which was not the same as knowing what you had. The photograph was not documentation of anything scientific. It was a man wanting to keep a picture of something he loved, against the probability that it would shortly not exist to be loved. He submitted a comment at the second public hearing. The hearing was held in the county building in February, about 30 people attending. Earl waited until the comment period and then stood and said what he had to say. He described the bloom flat. He described its seasonal flooding pattern. The early fill, the pale green, the way it flooded before the surrounding wetland did. He said his family had been farming the adjacent property for 3 generations and had always known this depression flooded differently, behaved differently, and had always left it alone for exactly that reason. He said he believed it was a vernal pool. He had learned that term from his daughter, who had looked it up after he described the bloom flat to her one evening during the project hearings, and who had shown him enough about what vernal pools supported that he now had a better vocabulary for what he had been describing his whole life. He said he believed a fairy shrimp species might be using the bloom flat as habitat. He didn't know this. He was inferring it from the biology articles his daughter had found for him. The State Transportation Authority's wetland delineator, a careful man named Holt, listened respectfully. He said the depression Earl had described had been assessed during the field survey and classified as non-jurisdictional upland based on the standard 3-parameter delineation methodology. He said the field survey had found no indicators of wetland hydrology, vegetation, or soils in that location. Earl asked when the survey had been conducted. Holt said August. Earl said, it's dry in August. You have to see it in March. Holt said the 3-parameter delineation methodology specified survey conditions that were standard across all seasons, and that an August survey was valid under methodology. Earl said he understood. He thanked Holt for his time. He sat down. He was not angry. He had been a farmer for 40 years, and he had spent 40 years navigating the gap between what he knew about a piece of ground and what could be demonstrated to someone who had never stood on it. That gap was not injustice. It was a condition of having local knowledge in a world organized around documented evidence. Holt was doing his job correctly. The methodology specified August. The August survey had found upland. The documentation was accurate for what the documentation measured. Earl knew that the gap between what he knew and what he could prove had a specific shape, and that the shape it was almost always exactly this. He spent the following weeks in a state of uncertainty he hadn't anticipated. He had been confident, when he stood up at the hearing, that the bloom flat was something worth protecting. He was less confident, walking home, that he had described it in a way to protect it, or that anything he could say would. He also began to wonder, in the specific way that doubt worked when you had time to let it, whether he was certain about the fairy shrimp. He had inferred it from biology articles, not from observation. He had never actually looked for fairy shrimp in the bloom flat, because he hadn't known what fairy shrimp were until his daughter showed him photographs 3 months ago. He had stood at the hearing and said he believed the bloom flat might be vernal pool habitat, and he had believed it when he said it. But belief and knowledge were different things in a room where the other side had survey data, and he was aware that the gap between them was exactly where his case was weakest. For all he knew, the bloom flat supported nothing unusual beyond whatever ordinary wetland invertebrates lived in a seasonal shallow depression in Oregon. The biology might be entirely mundane, and his family's 3 generations of leaving it alone might simply have been prudent farming practice with no deeper ecological significance. He went back to the bloom flat in late February and spent 2 hours standing in the mud, looking at the water as carefully as he could, trying to see whether there was anything in it. He had brought a jar, and had filled it with water from the center of the pool and held it up against the sky and looked through it, the way he had once seen a child look for tadpoles in a similar jar. There was nothing he could identify. There was movement, possibly, something at the limit of what his eyes could distinguish from the movement of the water itself. He couldn't tell. The water was cloudy from the recent fill. Whatever lived in it was invisible to him from the surface, the way the most important things in a body of water usually were. He poured the water back and walked home, aware that he'd come out here to gather certainty, and had gathered nothing except cold feet and a deeper understanding of how little he knew about what he was asking people to protect. He didn't know what he was looking at. He went home and called his daughter, who called a biologist she'd met through the county extension office, who said she'd come out to look at the bloom flat in March. The biologist's name was Dr. Hargrove, and she had been conducting vernal pool surveys in the county for 2 years, trying to document habitat that was consistently missed by standard delineation surveys because it only existed in the wet phase, which the regulatory methodology's timing requirement tended to miss. She came out on a clear March morning in rubber waders with net and collection kit, and Earl walked her to the bloom flat the way he had walked it every spring for 60 years. He had not known what to expect from her, whether she would arrive skeptical or credulous or simply professional, the way scientists sometimes arrived at things, checking boxes in a methodology rather than actually looking. She arrived curious, which was different from all of those, and which made Earl feel better about the walk before they had even reached the flat. The flat was fully flooded. The pale green was there. She knelt at the edge and ran the net through the water column near the substrate and pulled it up and looked at what was in it. Earl watched her face. After a moment, she said, "There they are." She showed him the net. He couldn't see what she was pointing to until she directed his attention to a section of the water in the net, where small translucent shapes, almost invisible, barely there, were moving. Vernal pool fairy shrimp, a state-listed species of concern, present and active in the water that the August survey had classified as dry upland. Dr. Hargrove straightened up and looked at the depression. Its extent, its depth, the pale green of the bloom. She asked Earl how long his family had called it the bloom flat. He said, "As long as I can remember. My grandfather used the name." She said, "The bloom is the algae the shrimp eat. The early flooding is a trigger for the shrimp's emergence from dormancy." Your family was describing the shrimp's habitat and their feeding ecology without knowing that's what you were describing. The name encoded the biology. Earl looked at the water. He thought about his father standing at this edge 60 years ago, telling him, "You don't plant here. The water doesn't behave the way it behaves in the rest of the bog." A practical instruction that turned out to be something more. His father hadn't known about fairy shrimp. Neither had his grandfather. They had known. The water behaves differently here, and when the water behaves differently, you leave alone, and the name you give it is the name of the thing the water does, so that the next generation knows what you're talking about when you tell them to leave it alone. The name and the farming practice around it had done the work protection without any of them understanding what they were protecting. 3 generations of not knowing that had functioned exactly like knowing. Dr. Hargrove filed an emergency request with the State Transportation Authority to delay the Southern Footprint's construction pending a formal vernal pool assessment. She filed it the same afternoon she visited the bloom flat, which told Earl something about how significant she thought the finding was. The request cited her March survey findings: the fairy shrimp presence, the active bloom, the subsurface hydrology indicators she had documented in the wet phase, and Earl's 3-generation description of the feature's seasonal behavior as the evidence establishing that the August delineation had been conducted outside the feature's functional wet phase. She noted in her filing that the feature was locally known as the bloom flat, and that this name had been in continuous use by the adjacent farming family for at minimum 3 generations, constituting an informal but consistent record of the feature's distinctive seasonal behavior. The authorities' response was careful and deliberate. It acknowledged the March survey findings. It initiated a formal review. What the formal review established, over the following 6 weeks, was this. The Bloom Flat was a vernal pool supporting a state-listed fairy shrimp species whose presence had not been detected in the August delineation because fairy shrimp existed in the Bloom Flat only in its wet phase, which ended in May, and the August survey had found a dry depression with no visible biological activity. The interchange project was redesigned. The southern footprint was shifted 40 feet north, adding cost and construction time, but preserving the Bloom Flat and the wetland buffer zone that Dr. Hargrove's assessment established around it. The authority issued a revised environmental assessment that included the vernal pool finding, formally adding the Bloom Flat to the county's protected wetland inventory under its legal name, Seasonal Vernal Pool Feature, Township 14S, Range 10W, Section 22. A grid reference and a regulatory designation. Earl read the designation in the revised document and found it both accurate and completely beside the point. The Bloom Flat was still the Bloom Flat. The name in the document was for the government. The name in the family was for the ground. Earl was standing at its edge on a March morning 2 years after the redesign. The flat flooded the way it always flooded, the pale green visible in the early light. He had brought his granddaughter, his daughter's daughter, 9 years old, wearing rubber boots that were slightly too large and holding his hand with the grip of a child navigating uncertain ground. He had told her in the car what the Bloom Flat was and what had happened with the highway project and what Dr. Hargrove had found in the water. He showed her the pale green in the water. He told her, "This is the Bloom Flat. When you see the green in the water in March, the shrimp are active. You don't put machinery in here. You don't plant here. You leave it alone." She looked at the water carefully. She asked if she could see the shrimp. He said they were too small to see without a net and a good eye, but they were in there. Dr. Hargrove had shown him. They were invisible but present, the way important things in water usually were, invisible from the surface, going about their business in a layer of the world that required effort and specific knowledge to reach. She asked if they had a name. He said, "The scientists call them fairy shrimp, but we've always called this place the Bloom Flat, and the name tells you what you need to know about it. It blooms early, and when it blooms, something is happening in the water. That's enough to know. The Bloom Flat is enough." She thought about this for a moment. She was 9, and she was the kind of child who, when she decided something was worth being serious about, gave her full attention and did not look away until she had decided what she thought. Earl had noticed this about her. It was a quality that reminded him of his own father. She said, "I'll remember it." He believed her. He had not expected to feel so strongly about whether she would remember it. He had not expected, when he drove out this morning with the idea of showing her the Bloom Flat, that the morning would feel like the most important thing he had done in 2 years. But standing at the edge of the Bloom Flat in March with his granddaughter in her 2 large rubber boots, watching the pale green in the early light, he understood that the name was a whole of what had protected this place for 3 generations, and that what he was doing now was the same thing his grandfather had done when he stood here and said, "You don't plant in the Bloom Flat." He was passing it forward, in the only form it had ever traveled. They stood at the edge for a while longer, watching the pale green in the water in the particular quiet of early March, when the rest of the wetland was still waking up and the Bloom Flat had already begun.